Hi. We've spent time thinking about the shapes and forms of poems and how we can guide readers through them with the structure of our lines and other strategies. I'm Liz Whiteacre, and today we're going to focus on how imagery and leaping in our poems can add another layer of meaning and help us articulate our visions to our readers. Our goals today are to think about how we can explore vivid imagery through varied figurative language techniques. So we can use a lot of different means to produce imagery for our readers and also explore leaping in poems. Leaping may be a technique that you are already familiar with, but you've not given it a lot of thought before. In the 1970s, poet Robert Bly became really interested in the work of Dr. Paul MacLean. This is around the time when MRIs were starting to be used in various research for brain mapping, and people were exploring how our brain works as we receive different stimulus. And so Robert Bly started to consider what poems can do inside people's brains. We're thinking about the relationship between that limbic node, what they called in those early days the reptilian brain, our sense of fight or flight, the cortex, so that kind of comes around that part in the interior of our brain, which they used to call the mammal brain, and that helps us process our sense of community. And then that neocortex, the quintessential wrinkly brain that we see in our Halloween decorations, which they started to discover was often responsible for complex process problems, kind of processing different spiritual components or creative components that people were working with. And so Bly noticed that when stimulus, like a poem, involve the movement between those different areas of the brain rather than just staying in one spot during the duration of the poem, that he, at least as a reader, found those poems very compelling. And here's a quote from his book, Leaping Poetry, which I hope you will also check out. He says, "A poet who is leaping makes a jump from an object soaked in unconscious substance to an object or idea soaked in conscious psychic substance." So, kind of moving from that fight or flight feeling in the limbic node, zip, moving over to the cortex, zip, moving over to the neocortex and back again. And maybe you might move quite a few times in a few moments of a poem. He felt that the real joy of poetry is to experience this leaping inside a poem. Going hand in hand with leaping, often imagery is driving that leap, is the idea that images are forms that lead us to inhabit abstraction as if from within, and so begin to know our kinship with the wide field of being. And this is a quote from poet Jane Hirschfield, the idea that images offer us an anchor or a touchstone when we're talking about abstract feelings, emotions, situations that are hard to articulate. Giving readers something concrete can help them appreciate and understand what the speaker in the poem is trying to share. I think it's important to think about imagery as beyond visual stimulation. Sometimes we think, oh, image, we think just about our sense of sight, the picture being presented to us. But imagery involves all of the senses. And here you'll notice that I've listed more than five based on more recent research. We have our sight, so what we're seeing, our touch, hearing, smell, taste, and those are senses that most of us will be familiar with, but also this sense of proprioception, and that is that sense of our body's awareness in space where we are at. If you imagine a police officer stopping a car that perhaps has been a little reckless and ask the driver to get out and ask the driver to touch their nose. Um, with their fingers, they're trying to assess that sense. Is it impaired? Is the person aware enough of where they are in space in relationship to other things? Are they in control of that? And so that's something that we as poets can also make use of and explore in our poems. So you'll notice that image I had originally has gotten much bigger. And I thought it would be fun to give ourselves some time to practice using those six senses. So you might choose to create a bulleted list, kind of ticking off the senses in your brain and thinking, what would this smell like? What would this sound like? Or if you prefer to do a free write where you're describing this moment, I'd like you to think about these two bears. There's one on the left-hand corner who's sitting on a stool, his arm outstretched towards a bear on the other side of a river. We're in a very snowy scene with mountains. We have some clouds, and that bear across the river is standing. Also looks like it is in a moment of communication. So we're going to take 4 minutes, and I'd like you to write about this scene, describing its senses, what's happening here. And if you would like to put a narrative to it, you are absolutely welcome to do so. All right. So grab your writing utensil and piece of paper, even if it's a scrap. I have set the timer. Go. Describe this scene using all 5 to 6 senses. Now we're about halfway through our time. You might think, yeah, I got it. And you're reaching for your phone, reaching for a snack, waiting to move forward. So I say push further, right? What does this really smell like, sound like, feel like? What is this icy domain? What is it for these bears? What do they feel like in this environment? You can even go so far as to what might they be having a conversation about? What does it sound like? What's their tone, right? When you're thinking about proprioception, are they aware of where they are in this mountain range? And is it their home? Right? So push, push, push. We have another minute and a half, and I'd like to see you go a little bit further than where you originally planned to stop. Start to finish up your thoughts. All right. Deep breath. That was a big 4 minutes. I know that sometimes when you're exercising, you're practicing, you're writing, it can be a little uncomfortable. But I think it's a good comparison or analogy to think about exercise for your body. When you're pushing yourself, stressing yourself, making yourself go a little bit further than you initially thought you could, as you are practicing different techniques in writing, it just strengthens your resolve, it strengthens your abilities, it helps you hone those skills, and the time you put in this practice will pay off later on in a moment where you really drill down, you look, and you come up with that beautiful image or that moment of expression in a poem that really connects with your reader. So I thank you. Hold on to that description and we'll come back to it. We're going to focus on four techniques: allusion, simile, and metaphor, which we'll talk about as a team, and leaping in your poems as different ways to engage your readers with imagery. There are many others, but we're going to focus on these big ones in my opinion. When you get these down, then you can go on to other hyperbole, right? There are a whole lot of things you can do out there, but I think that these are really helpful for beginning poets. I'm going to share an example with you of a poem that I wrote. This was a poem where I wrote it without any leaps when I first composed it, and it bothered me, and it wasn't quite what I wanted it to be. And so I went back in and revised and added in a few things to the poem, which I'm going to highlight for you, including allusion, simile, and leaping. So this is called Retirees Pity Me During Water Aerobics. These decaying bodies, barely covered by lycra, have bobbed, bent, and flexed for over a year as I've instructed them in the community pool. They've complained affectionately if the water is less than 78 degrees and called me sweetheart. Take it easy on us, they teased if I ordered an extra set. Chores or Kevin's visit were on my mind when I shouted ski or curl or push, churning chlorinated water. Now I've still bills to pay, chores, Kevin's visit, but I obsess if my brace looks stupid, stumped beneath my new tankini. It's vanity, working to hide it from these octogenarians, some taking similar bursitis, arthritis, and pain medications. But it's ugly, like the perm I begged mom for in seventh grade. The 2-week home trial stuck, and months of hiding frizz followed. I check and recheck to make sure the straps haven't flopped out, drag up my butt, invite stares. I instruct from a chair on the deck, goosebumped and on display, unable to hide behind well coiffed hair, manicured clothes. My arms and legs feebly gesture the water aerobic veteran's moves. Gossip and chatter is absent, but for calls of, "How you doing, honey?" I'm no longer invincible youth, no age before beauty jokes when the ladies shuffled with me out of the locker room. I used to be a shampoo commercial girl, ponytail swishing, routines robust. I used to bounce effortlessly in the water while they struggled to keep up, their bodies protesting. And now, Propped by brace, I watch from the sidelines as an eager pubescent in the bleachers watches other kids dance. I call scissor, egg beater, sweep, and their buoyant bodies respond, beautifully churn water. So, one thing I added to the poem as I was working on it some years ago was an allusion. And an allusion is a reference to something known outside of the text or the poem. We'll see that sometimes where we'll be reading, and a very popular one that we study in our literature courses would be allusions to Greek mythology. Or maybe there's an allusion to a character in a popular novel or movie, right? So we're taking something that our audience would generally know fairly well, ideally, outside of our poem and pulling it in. So in the line, I used to be a shampoo commercial girl. I'm hoping that people's brains while they're reading will jump to a commercial that they've seen. Me growing up, it was the suave. The suave girl in the commercial who had, these very wavy locks, and she'd flip them around and be leaning over the sink. But you are going to be thinking about your own shampoo commercial and the confidence in those people when they are showing off their locks to you. And even though we might not be picturing the same commercial, we are picturing the same level of confidence and that verb of life, if you will. And so by pulling that into the poem, just this little bit, I'm able to pull in everything, all of the commercials you've seen, all of the stereotypes you have, all of your personal responses to seeing those people in those commercials. And so that one little gesture pulls all of that other stuff outside of the poem into it. So an illusion can be a really effective way of accessing a lot of information and putting it in. Another technique you could use is developing a simile or metaphor in your poem. I put these two together because they are working with comparisons in similar ways. A simile is a comparison between two things that uses the words as or like. And the reason why as or like is used is because a simile is taking a part of something else and comparing it. So you have a little bit more control here as the poet. You might say, um, I am as strong as a rock, right? And so you're taking of all of a rock's qualities, you're picking out one thing. There are a lot of idioms that we think about out there, like, let's say, clever as a fox. Well, a fox has a lot of different attributes that we might pick from, or might imagine. If we say fox, like what comes to mind? And so if you want to be very specific about what your readers picture or bring into the poem, a simile allows you to do that, whereas a metaphor compares two whole things. If I say I am a rock or I am a fox, I'm saying I'm the whole thing, right? And as a reader, you can pick and choose, you can take the whole thing, you can identify and decide what you want to bring into the poem. So in my poem about being a water instructor, in the midst of a spinal injury, I chose towards the end of the poem to create a simile. So I'm watching all of the students in the class doing their water aerobic routines, and I'm trying to compare that to something that my readers might have more experience with. Where I am publishing work, my readers are adults. I'm not writing for younger people, and so most of those people reading, including you, having just read it, listened to it, have gone through pubescence, right? We have been in middle school or junior high, and hopefully have experienced a school dance. And so watching from the sidelines as an eager pubescent in the bleacher watches other kids dance, there's that sense of longing, right? Of feeling apart. There's choosing not to get into the mix and just letting loose, right? So that is a moment where I wanted to take those emotions that you, dear reader, may have experienced if you also sat in the bleachers, at least to rest. I know y'all are rocking it, but at least to rest and observe those emotions and feelings. I'm hoping that you're bringing into the poem here and understanding a little bit about how I was feeling in a brace, cold, in a swimsuit, on display in front of people who are all able to do something that, in this case, I physically wasn't able to do, but something that I also felt apart from that I wanted to be able to do with them. And then I also included a leap. So here in the poem, I inserted a moment where I'm taking the reader outside of the poem to another part of my life. So this can be an analogy, it can be a little mini side story, it could be internal thoughts. And so all of those things I kind of group into a leap. In the same way that an illusion is a leap and a metaphor and a simile, those are also leaps. But this is, to me, a little bit bigger package where we're kind of pausing where we're at in the poem, moving over here, and then coming back. So the vanity that I'm feeling in this moment of the poem, being a little embarrassed, right, of how looking back, I'm like, oh, I was being so silly, nobody cared, right? But in that moment of suddenly not being able to um, stand, sit, walk, lie down without a brace after this spinal injury, it felt as though it called too much attention to myself, and I felt a little foolish in it. Um, I kept wearing it because I needed it, right? But it's something that I didn't know if people would fully get, but I do know that sometimes we've all made choices in how we are presenting ourselves to other that in the moment we realize, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Right? You get to where you were going and you realize nobody else interpreted this in the same way I did, or I not feeling it. I wish I could, you know, go home and change. And so I thought about a time in middle school again, kind of keeping with that same sense of later in the poem, looking at the dance. This is also a moment where I'm just feeling so awkward, and middle school was an awkward time for me. So I think that that's why I had that connection to that part of my life, and this now part in my 20s. So I decided to compare how I felt on the pool deck, thinking about, oh, like how do I look, um, to a time in seventh grade when, honest to gosh truth, I just begged my mom for a perm and she put it in, and it was supposed to go away after 2 weeks. I was just supposed to test it out, and it did not. Right. Eventually, she had to get a chemical straightener to make my hair straight once again. Um, and so, kind of moving to that moment in middle school and sharing that, oh, right, there's all something we regret from middle school. um, and then coming back, I hoped that you might go to your place where you had that moment of maybe insecurity or awkwardness, or I've made a terrible mistake, and then come back to this poem with those feelings so that you can better understand the feelings that the speaker has, or in this case, me personally had in that moment of my life. So there's a lot of power to being able to move around and create comparisons. And what I hope you'll do is take a poem that you've written. It might be way in the past that you're a little unsatisfied with, or it might be a poem that you've written very recently. And I'd like you to identify a couple places in the poem where you're talking about something that might be a little lesser experienced or more unique, or maybe just really abstract, where you're like, I was devastated, and you might be able to cultivate a moment there where you can make a comparison to another kind of devastation that readers might have more familiarity with. through a leap to another time in your life, or through a metaphor, analogy, all of those different things, illusion, um, where we can have a comparison, right? So, okay, you've never had a spinal injury, but maybe you've had this other experience, and these are kind of similar, right? How you felt here might have been a little bit how I felt in this moment. So, revise to add in 2 or 3 leaps into that poem, just like I did in Retirees Pity Me during water aerobics, and see what happens. It'll help you practice your skills of imagery and leaping, and you might find that your poem is more robust and better off. Share it with some readers, maybe a before and after, and see how they respond to the leaps that you've included in your poem. You can go a step further and think about composing or coming up with poems and leaping as you go, introducing imagery and leaps as you write. And so, this is another challenge if you're up for it, a writing prompt. It's like prompts. So, start with a unique experience you've had. For example, in my life, it was seeing retirees pity me during water aerobics. And that's what I led with in my title. You might start with something else and leave that context in the title. That's another technique. Tell people up front, hey, this is the scene, this is what's going on. And then in the poem, share with your readers what it's like, right? Eating ice cream is like what, right? What would you compare it to? And use a lot of different techniques to get that across to your readers. Think about all of your senses. Think about different things you can create connections to that are going to help them understand more fully what that's all about. So, looking ahead, we are going to be practicing these techniques and writing poems. And soon we're going to talk about, well, when we have it all on the page, what happens next? So, thinking about how we can revise on our own, how we can solicit feedback, how we can take reader responses and our own good sense and use that to revise our poems and cultivate them, help them evolve. I hope that you enjoy exploring imagery and leaping in your poems. I can't wait to see what you create.